Welcome! Today I will show you how to destroy your opponent in the Najdorf defense. And I will show you a bunch of opening, middle games and endgame principles, so stay tuned and improve your rating. Here we have the Sicilian defense, where the knight is put on f3 to protect the d4 break. And the Sicilian is known for the double-edged positions, as white often gets an attack on this side of the board and black often an attack on this side of the board. Here the move d4, challenging the center, and if black would not take back, white has a great center. So black takes back and white takes with the pawn. Also taking back with the queen is an option, and then you get into theory of these kind of lines. But my opponent took back with the knight, and here knight to f6, attacking the e4 pawn, which is weak and undefended, so white needs to react. So make sure to develop and ideally make your opponent react on what you're doing. Knight to c3, protecting the pawn and developing at the same time. Great move. Remember the opening principles. Ensure that you have a pawn in the center. Develop your pieces. White is doing well. Black also already has developed the knight. And then make sure that your king is getting castled. Here e5 right away is not a good move. It's something Nakamura played against Caruana. It is playable but very fishy, because after knight to f5, white is already very good in this position. But that's why black plays the move a6, and this is the Najdorf variation of the Sicilian defense, which has been played so many times on the highest levels, and also sometimes it's played on the lower levels, but there's so much theory that it's very difficult to understand all lines in the Najdorf. But Giri has a great course on this. I definitely recommend it to you. I'm not getting sponsored by him. Not yet, I would say. And what is the move for white in this position? Well, what is the best move for white in this position? Well, there's so many options. You can play f3. You can get your bishop here. You can get this bishop here. You can play h4. You can play rook g1. You can play queen to e2. You can play queen to d3. There's so many options here. You can play queen to f3. But white goes for bishop to e2. And that's also where I said, right, there's so many options for white, so there's so many types of lines, so much theory you need to know. But you can also outplay your opponent if you know one line very well and you know exactly that line, right? Here, e5, attacking the knight, and the knight needs to move. Either going to f3 is a good move, or to g3. I would say to g3 is the more common approach and happens 70–80% of the times I played against this position. Here, bishop to e7, developing, making room for the king to castle, and also still protecting this pawn. And in these kind of positions, white is fighting for the weak d5 square, trying to get a knight or a bishop on this square, and black will try to protect and defend this square and play around it. And this bishop is always a good defender of the d6 pawn in these kind of positions. Here, bishop to e3, developing the bishop, maybe queen here, and then maybe f3, a pawn storm on the king side of the board. Bishop to e6, defending the d5 square and developing at the same time, and here f3. White makes room for the pawns to move forward, but it's perhaps a bit premature, and castles is the preferred option by the computer, and then you play for the f4 break later on. But f3 also completely playable. Here I developed the knight, and this is the kind of setup you often see in these Najdorf structures with e5 and d6. White develops the queen, making sure that it can castle next and then connect the rooks. So looking at the golden rules of the opening, white has developed the pieces. Also, middle game principle is to centralize your pieces. That's what white has done very well. And it only has to bring a king to safety. Looking at the black side of the board, also a pawn in the center like white, and centralized pieces and all developed, also only needs to castle next. b5, a bit too early in this position. b5 is a very common theme in the Najdorf, but here a4 would be a good move to challenge this pawn, and the pawn is a bit weak, because if you move it forward, then knight to d5 and takes, and then the pawn here is already a bit weak, right? And if you would ever go a5, then the bishop will enter the position. So this was clearly overlooked by black. And takes is also not something you want, because then you take back with the rook, and this pawn is then super weak, already being attacked by the bishop. So, but that's not what white did, and went for g4. And then followed by h4 probably at some point, and see how these bishops already protect the progress of these pawns in a beautiful way. Here the move b5 Great move by black, attacking the knight, and the knight has to move somewhere. It could go here, but then it doesn't have a lot of future, but it's an option. But the most likely response, and that's also what white played, is knight to d5, entering the square it would really like to go to anyway. But after bishop takes and pawn takes, white doesn't have a good way to protect this pawn. Do you see the best move for black in this position? The only move that keeps an advantage for black, knight to b6. Attacking the pawn now twice, and white cannot really properly defend it as the bishop cannot join via here. The e-pawn is already gone and the bishop cannot here because then it's taken. And after g5 you can take with the f knight. So there's just one option left for white, and that's to take the knight. And black achieved what it wanted to achieve, getting rid of the bishop pair from white. One of the key middle game principles, make sure to keep the bishop pair, and that's something white did not achieve here. And look at these weak squares around the king. White can castle long now, it cannot castle short, it's not allowed. So this queen is very strong and black is clearly better here. a3, challenging the b4 pawn from black. And yeah, this is not really an option because then takes, the rook hangs in the end because it's not defended. Loose pieces drop off. Instead, black takes the pawn and white takes back with the rook, developing the rook. But at the same time, white cannot castle now anymore because the rook is now here. And it cannot castle short for now anyway as well. So the white king is a bit weak, and that's something black will play against in this position. Castles, making sure that the rook will enter the game, maybe to c8, maybe to b8. A lot of options here for black. King f1 would have been best to see if you can simply castle your king manually, and after e4 you simply go to g2, and after takes, well, at some point maybe the rook goes here, and this is a somewhat fine position for white. Still, black is much better. But when leaving the king on the e1 square, white's king is very vulnerable, and here white goes for h4. While the king is already vulnerable, it goes for another pawn push. It wants to go here and here, but nothing much is going on so far yet. Here, rook to d8, giving a question mark, but I think the best move in the position according to the computer is bishop to d8, and very hard to spot, I would say. Probably trying to see if you can get the bishop here, and maybe preventing the knight from going here at some point. Rook to c8 instead, and here you cannot really progress your pawns, right? Because do you see a great square for the knight? There is this weakness on f4 in the position of white. And if you now push this pawn, then the knight will easily and happily go to this square, and it will cover so many squares around white's king, which results in a very strong position. So g5 not played, but bishop to d3. And this gives a question mark. Why? Because of a very concrete reason. Black can overwhelm white now in this position. Still, it's about the f4 square. Black would really love to have a knight on the f4 square, which would be very strong and would give a winning advantage. But if you would take here, then the bishop goes here, and if you then go to f4, the rook hangs. But I calculated it all the way through, and I thought that still I have a clear advantage with my knight on f4. So I took this pawn. And the best move for white is to take here, and then to take here. But black is super active, and rook a to b8 would be a great move here, and then to take here at some point. And this doesn't work because of d5. And if you would take here, then there's a check on e3, and if the king goes here, for example, then you bring in the rook, and there's no really check for your king. But white went for the material and played bishop to e4 and knight to f4. Look at this knight. So well placed, while this rook is completely out of the game. So a great exchange, sacrifice from white, and I simply take back the bishop. My rook is a bit out of the game here, so I need to find a way to activate my pieces. Also, the bishop is a bit out of the game, the queen is strong, the knight is strong, so now I'm looking for ways, okay, how in the next position can I make sure that my bishop and the rook join the party and join the attack. Here, queen to f2, offering the queen trade, and then there's always the question, do you go for the queen trade? Do you not go for the queen trade? Well, the rule of thumb says, If you're defending, try to go for a queen trade. If you're attacking, like I am, don't go for a queen trade. So I simply decline the queen trade and I go to c7. b7 would have been slightly better, but okay, still great position for me and a -2 advantage. King to f1. Now my opponent tries to hide and castle manually, but it's a bit late. I do have some nice tempo moves in this position. d5, great move, opening up the diagonal for the bishop, also getting a good center, maybe progressing the pawns at some point, and attacking the rook at the same time. The rook goes back, and here I go queen to c4, attacking this pawn, so I can also bring in the rook at some point, and maybe target this pawn, and the king goes to g1. Here the computer likes h5, attacking white's camp, but I went for a5, trying to dislodge the knight. If I would go to a4, then the knight has to move at some point when my rook moves. And you cannot really take, right? Then queen b5 and you cannot really protect the knight anymore as the rook is undefended and loose pieces drop off. And if you would take with the rook, well, we simply take, and then queen to b5 is also a great position for black. King to h2, but this is a blunder. Why? Well, let's see. The knight covers some great squares around the king. If the queen were to enter here, then this will be a checkmate if this queen is not here, right? So can we deflect the queen from the f2 square? Yes, we can. Bishop to h4. And we attack the queen. And if takes, then we have a checkmate in 2. Checkmate. So you cannot really take the bishop, and therefore queen goes to d2. And look at my pieces here. My minor pieces completely overpower white's camp. Here I go for a4. Now the pawn is protected by the queen, attacking the knight, but still the knight doesn't have to move yet because the pawn is still being pinned on the rook, which is not defended. And yeah, that will be a checkmate. So the rook enters the game, and here I go rook to c8, protecting the queen. Now attacking the knight, right, because my rook is not hanging in the end, so my opponent needs to act and place the knight back. Here rook to c6 is a great idea, going for the checkmate. But I didn't see this idea, and I went queen takes on c2 instead. Taking the queen is completely losing, because if the king goes back here, bishop to g3. And look how all these squares are taken from the king. The king cannot really move forward. And if you would take the pawn, you give a check. And now do you see a way of getting the king to this side of the board? Yes, check. The king has to move here. Then you give another check. The king cannot go back, has to go here. But you have now a great x-ray attack. You can simply take the pawn and the king cannot go anywhere than going back. Then you give a check again. And now you've freed up the way to attack the rook with a check and you win the game. So white played king to h1 and here I go h6. It's a bit slow, question mark, but I was afraid for, you know, some rook landing here at some point and the back rank checkmates. Still, this is completely winning for me. Here knight to d3 would have been the best attempt for my opponent, and after some trades I simply pick up the pawn and yeah, I'm quite a lot of pawns up for the exchange, and this is completely winning for me. Instead my opponent played knight to a2, and that's a blunder. Why? Well, here I bring back my queen, making room for the rook to enter the second row, and white is in a lot of trouble. Knight to c3, blocking the entrance of the rook, but I can attack the knight in one move and then still making sure I get entry to this second row. d5. Yes, the knight can go here, but I enter the second row. And that's something white cannot allow with the weak black king. Here my opponent plays rook to a3, attacking my queen. But I have a great tempo move here. Do you see the best move in this position? Yes, taking on c3. And if you take the queen, well, then I take your queen. And now this rook is under attack. So now you have to move to c3, but this is just completely winning for black. So white doesn't have time to take and needs to move the queen away, because the queen is under attack as well. Queen to d7, attacking the rook. And this is the defender of my position. If it were to check, then maybe the queen would go back, g6. It is defended here at the moment, but this is a awkward position. Also, my queen is still under attack. So what's the best move in this position by far? Queen takes on d1 with a check. If you go here, then the queen hangs, so you have to take back. But then, and this follow-up is something you should have seen, when you took the rook, and that c takes b2. And the rook cannot get behind the pawn, right? Because then we simply take. And if you take here, well then the rook enters white's camp. And the queen is pinned to the king. Instead, rook to a1, protecting the first row, but we can simply take this rook. And in this position we have two minor pieces, a rook and a bunch of pawns. This is very much winning for us, but we have to play it correctly. And the next move I make is already a great start. Bishop to g3. See, we already showed this pattern, but these squares in front of the king are now blocked. And the queen has to defend the first row. So you cannot really take. The queen goes here, protecting the c1 square. But now I go to d8, attacking this square, and now the queen goes to c2. And why was this decision important and relevant? Sequence of moves. Well, now I can play the move a3. The queen is not protecting it anymore, and I threaten to go a2 anyway. And the queen still cannot take it, because then I will give a checkmate. Here, king to g1. Yeah, still the king is behind these pawns, so I play a2 and threaten to promote. And like I said, this is simply checkmate. So there's one move for my opponent, and that's queen to a4, attacking the pawn, but it cannot really take it. But I cannot promote either, because then it will simply take my queen. Still, this is a winning position for me. But I play rook to c8, threatening checkmate again. Queen to a3, and now I give a check, and I go for a checkmating pattern. And because my rook is now on c8, I can actually enter white's camp. The king goes forward, and here I go to c8, threatening to give a check. And then, well, you will see it on the board later, but there's one more move which gives a checkmate. Here, white could have gone for a8 check, but then I go simply here, check, and white picks up the knight, but I promote with the queen, and after takes and check, this is a checkmate in 7 for black. Instead, my opponent took the a2 pawn, but this is checkmate in 2. Do you see the checkmate in 2? Check. The king has to go to h3. There is no escape squares left. Can you check it? This is not the right move, because then the king simply goes back. Knight, checkmate. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and see you next time. Bye bye.